On this story now, joining us from Kabul is the independent researcher Melissa Cornet. She lived in Afghanistan before the Taliban took power and stayed for several years after they did. Melissa, it's great to speak to you. Thank you for speaking to France 24 this morning.
Thank you.
So rare to get a perspective like you can offer us this morning from the city. What's it like in Kabul today for this anniversary?
So today has been declared a special holiday by the de facto authorities. They are planning a number of celebration, but of course not celebrating all the 21 million Afghan women and girls who cannot join the celebration, who also cannot leave their home. UN Women just published a very interesting report that says that most of the Afghan women they interviews now leave their home on average 1 to twice a month because of all of the restrictions imposed on them, but also because of fear.
Now, I believe you left Afghanistan around 2024. You're now back, but no longer living there permanently. How did your life change once the Taliban took power?
So, as a foreign woman, I do not have at all the same amount of restrictions that Afghan women do, which is why I can continue to a certain extent working in the country, reporting on it as a researcher and as a journalist. For me, as a foreign woman, things change in the sense that now the Taliban pride themselves with keeping internationals, tourists, you might have seen of influencers, safe. The war is over. It is over because the Taliban have defeated NATO and are no longer attacking foreigners or Afghans. So to a certain extent, it's now safer to go around the country. But for me, as a foreign woman, it's still okay to go around and work. I would say the main difference is now I am safer being identified as a foreign woman, whereas before 2021, when I was traveling and working in Afghanistan, it was safer for me not to be perceived as a foreigner, to be very covered, which was and is easy as a woman.
Now, you've written about your interviews with Afghan women from rural areas in particular who were positive about the Taliban's return. Is there still this widespread sense for Afghans that they've brought peace and stability?
It's quite a nuanced version, but I can say from interviews I did 2 years ago in very conservative provinces like Wardak, where with photographer Kiana Hayeri, I went to interview actually Afghan women belonging to Taliban families. And for them, the end of the war was a relief because Afghanistan had been at war for decades at this point. And Afghan families were just really, really tired of the war and the impact it was having on them. These Taliban wives, Taliban mother were saying things are not great now. The economy is in a very bad shape. We don't have any schools for girls, even under Sharia. But at least the war is over. Now we are no longer worried about our sons or our husbands. And this is also a reality of the country now, despite the fact that half of the population is suffering what is the worst situation in the world for women. The country is no longer in conflict.
Now, some have described that situation, and you've written about this term, gender apartheid. And behind that term is this push to recognize what's happening as a crime. But as you've written, what might happen is if this does become a crime and then countries fail to act upon it, international law might be undermined further. Where has that debate gone in the last couple of years?
So, as you say, gender apartheid is the term most used now to describe the situation in Afghanistan. However, it is a crime that doesn't yet exist. And there is actually a very active campaign at the moment to codify this crime under a new UN convention currently being negotiated at the UN in New York. So, if the crime was codified and then if it was applied to Afghanistan, that might be a step in the right direction. However, at the moment, I think the Western international community and diplomats are a little bit at a loss with how to handle the situation because sanctions don't work, diplomacy doesn't work. We've seen that the ICC actually already issued a worst warrant for the supreme leader, and it didn't really have any concrete impact on the Taliban's policy and the situation in Afghanistan. And that's primarily because the Taliban don't really care about the sanction regime and about this arrest warrant. They don't leave the country. They don't have, properties in London like Russian oligarchs might, for example. So it's quite difficult because at the moment, this international sanction, international pressure, arrest warrants are not really bearing any concrete result. However, it remains extremely important to make sure that the appropriate legal framework is in place for the day things might change and we might be able to bring certain Taliban leaders to justice. But I think everyone is very aware that it's going to be a long journey.
And that regime might not be the gender apartheid slogan or definition, as it were, at least in your opinion.
Sorry, can you repeat?
And from what I'm gathering, you're saying that the gender apartheid push might not be the appropriate legal framework to eventually have.
I think gender apartheid is important to be codified so that you can really represent all of the comprehensive and detailed nuance range of the violation against women's rights. There are certain analysts that think that is counterproductive because if you do use these terms and apply them to Afghanistan and then nothing happens, like you said, it can end up weakening international law. So
Yeah,
it is a very difficult situation. I'm not gonna lie.
yeah, Melissa, the devil is in the details as always. And you've also said that, within the Taliban itself, there are not always the same views on women, but because there's this strict hierarchy, there's unlikely to be change from within without there being changes that might actually, happen in decades, not years.
That's true. And I think at the beginning of this second Taliban regime, so 2021, 2022, there was still a certain degree of hope that they were different from the first Taliban regime of the 1990s. And they were saying they would respect women's rights and the Sharia. They really wanted positive relationship with the world and with the neighbors. And to be very honest, I was in Afghanistan at the time and journalists could work, women could work, we could go to university. After a few months, however, we started seeing this kind of like slow descent with more than 100 decrees now taken against women and girls. And it's been 5 years. There hasn't been any progress. There hasn't been any of these edicts overturned, for example. So it's really hard to be hopeful that things could improve. We do know a certain part of the movement isn't happy with how strict certain restrictions are being applied, but it has not yet led to any internal change, any positive internal change when it comes to their policies towards Afghan women and girls.
Now, finally, we've talked a lot about how the values of the West interact with Afghanistan, but the values of the West are not actually the same as they were 5, 10, 15 years ago. Has Afghanistan, and particularly the humiliation surrounding the 2021 offensive, has that changed the Western values in a way, rather than the other way around?
It's a very interesting question because what I do notice in countries that were very involved in Afghanistan, such as the US or the UK, is that there is no public discussion regarding what happened. How could the most powerful armies in the world, with the amount of money and intelligence that they had, failed so blatantly in Afghanistan? The joke here in Kabul is if you feel useless, look at NATO and the US replaced the Taliban with the Taliban after 20 years of intervention. This is just very painful, I think, for a lot of people. And I do see a lot of anger from Afghan women directed at the international community because they do say, look, the West made the intervention about our rights. They came to save us, to liberate us, to educate us. And then in 2021, they abandoned us, knowing exactly what will happen. They knew exactly the Taliban would take over, and they knew from the first regime just how harsh life would be under the Taliban. So I really do think there's a need for a public discussion, like how could the West just fail so badly and just abandon Afghan women the way they did.
Melissa Cornet, thank you so much. Very valuable to get your input there from Taliban on this, the 5th anniversary of the seizure of Kabul.